The stagecoach lurched violently as it hit another rut in the sun-baked road, sending Eleanor Whitfield sprawling against the worn leather seat. She clutched her small carpetbag tighter, her knuckles white beneath her threadbare gloves. Through the dust-caked window, she watched the landscape transform from the gentle hills she'd known all her life to an alien expanse of scorched prairie grass and distant, snow-capped mountains that seemed to scrape the very heavens. It was 1870, and the West was still wild, still untamed, still hungry for souls brave or desperate enough to test its boundaries. Eleanor was neither brave nor adventurous. She was simply out of options. The driver's gruff voice cut through her reverie. "Carson's Creek. Next stop. All mail-order brides and other cargo, prepare yourselves." The words stung, reducing her to mere freight, but Eleanor had grown accustomed to such indignities. In Boston, she'd been damaged goods. A young woman of 23, whose reputation had been irreparably tarnished when old Mr. Hartwell, her employer at the textile mill, had cornered her in the storage room, though she'd fought him off and escaped before the worst could happen. The whispers had already begun. In the rigid social hierarchy of the East, a woman's virtue was her only currency, and even the suggestion of impropriety was enough to render her worthless. The other passengers, 2 weathered ranchers and a traveling preacher, had barely acknowledged her existence during the 3-day journey. She'd overheard their conversations at the way stations, their voices dripping with disdain as they discussed those Eastern women who sold themselves through newspaper advertisements to desperate Western men. No decent woman would travel thousands of miles to marry a stranger, the preacher had declared over supper the previous evening, his eyes fixed pointedly on Eleanor. "Mark my words, nothing good comes from such arrangements." Eleanor had kept her eyes on her meager meal of beans and hardtack, swallowing both the food and her pride with equal difficulty. As the stagecoach rolled into Carson's Creek, Eleanor pressed her face to the window, searching for any sign of the man whose advertisement she'd answered. Samuel Morrison. He'd called himself a respectable cattleman of 35 years, seeking a wife of good character to share in the building of his ranch. His letters had been brief but kind, promising her a home, respectability, and protection, everything she'd lost in Boston. The town was little more than a collection of weather-beaten buildings huddled along a dirt main street. The largest structure was a saloon, from which raucous laughter and piano music spilled into the afternoon air. A general store, a blacksmith shop, a small church with a crooked steeple, and a handful of other establishments completed the picture of frontier civilization. The stagecoach groaned to a halt in front of the depot, and Eleanor gathered her courage along with her belongings. She descended carefully, her Eastern dress, once her best, now travel-stained and wrinkled, drawing immediate attention from the townspeople who'd gathered to meet the stage. "That'll be her," she heard a woman whisper to her companion. "Another mail-order bride. 3rd one this year. You'd think they'd learn." Eleanor's cheeks burned, but she held her head high, scanning the small crowd for Samuel Morrison. Surely he would be here to meet her, to take her away from these prying eyes and cruel tongues. Minutes passed. The crowd dispersed, returning to their daily business. The stagecoach driver unloaded her trunk with unnecessary roughness, dropping it in the dust at her feet. "Someone meeting you, miss?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Mr. Samuel Morrison," Eleanor replied, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. "He's expecting me." The driver's expression shifted from indifference to something resembling pity. Morrison? The cattle rancher? He removed his hat, running a hand through his graying hair. "Miss, I'm sorry to be the one to tell you, but Sam Morrison's been dead near on 2 weeks now. Hunting accident, they say. Went after a wounded elk and never came back. They found him at the bottom of Widow's Canyon." The world seemed to tilt beneath Eleanor's feet. Dead. The word echoed in her mind, drowning out the sounds of the street. Her future, her escape, her last hope. All of it lay buried with a man she'd never even met. What am I to do?" The words came out as barely a whisper. The driver shrugged. already turning back to his coach. "That's not for me to say, Miss. Though if you're looking for lodging, Mrs. Patterson runs a boarding house on the other end of town. Might take you in if you can pay." Pay? With what? Eleanor had spent her last coins on the stagecoach fare, believing that Samuel would provide for her upon arrival. She stood frozen in the dusty street, her trunk at her feet, as the stagecoach rolled away, leaving her stranded in this harsh, unforgiving place. The sun beat down mercilessly, and she could feel the eyes of the townspeople upon her, some curious, others contemptuous, none offering help. She was about to gather her courage to approach someone, anyone, when a shadow fell across her. Eleanor looked up to see a man on horseback, his face obscured by the brim of his hat and several days' growth of beard. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in worn buckskins and a heavy coat despite the heat. A rifle rested across his saddle, and she could see the handle of a knife protruding from his boot. "You the woman Sam Morrison sent for?" His voice was low, rough as the landscape itself. Yes, but I'm told Mr. Morrison is—" She couldn't bring herself to say the word again. "Dead," the man finished for her, his tone matter of fact. 2 weeks now. He studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor felt exposed under his gaze, as if he could see through her careful facade to the desperation beneath. "You got somewhere to go?" he asked. Eleanor lifted her chin, pride warring with despair. "I'll manage." A sound that might have been a laugh escaped him. "No money, no connections, and too proud to beg. You'll last about as long as a snowflake in July." He shifted in his saddle, clearly preparing to ride on, then seemed to reconsider. "Sam was my neighbor, of sorts. Asked me to look out for his bride if anything happened to him. And you are Thomas McKenna." He didn't offer his hand or tip his hat, merely continued his assessment of her. "Got a cabin about 10 miles into the mountains. You can shelter there tonight while you figure out your next move. Tomorrow, I'll bring you back to town, and you can catch the next stage heading east." Eleanor bristled at his assumption. "Perhaps I don't wish to return east." This time, his laugh was unmistakable. "Lady, you're not cut out for this life. Look at you, soft hands, soft clothes, soft everything. The mountains would chew you up and spit you out before the first snow." His dismissal stung more than the townspeople's whispers. "I'm stronger than I appear. Mr. McKenna." "Maybe so." He extended a calloused hand down to her. "But tonight, you need shelter. Come morning, you can prove me wrong if you're so inclined." Eleanor stared at his offered hand, weighing her options. She could refuse, maintain her dignity, and likely spend the night in the street. Or she could accept help from this rough stranger and live to fight another day. The choice, like everything else in her life lately, was no choice at all. She took his hand, surprised by its warmth and strength as he pulled her up behind him on the horse. "My trunk. I'll send someone for it." He clicked his tongue, and the horse began moving. Eleanor had no choice but to wrap her arms around his waist to keep from falling, her face burning at the improper intimacy of the position. As they rode out of Carson's Creek, Eleanor caught the shocked and scandalized expressions of the townspeople. A mail-order bride, abandoned before she'd even met her intended, now riding off with the town recluse. She could only imagine the stories that would circulate by nightfall. The trail grew rougher as they climbed into the foothills, leaving civilization behind. The scent of pine replaced the dust of the town, and the air grew cooler. Eleanor had never seen such vast wilderness, such towering peaks and dense forests. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Neither spoke during the ride, though Eleanor had countless questions. Who was this Thomas McKenna? Why did he live so far from town? What had he meant when he'd called Samuel his neighbor of sorts, if his cabin was 10 miles away? By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The structure was small but solidly built, logs chinked with mud. A stone chimney already releasing a thin stream of smoke, It sat in a clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a small stable and various outbuildings nearby. Thomas dismounted first, then helped her down, his hands impersonal on her waist. "Go on inside," he said, already leading his horse toward the stable. "Fire's already going." Eleanor hesitated at the threshold, entering a strange man's home, alone, miles from anywhere. It went against every principle of propriety she'd been raised with. But what was propriety to her now? She'd already fallen so far from grace. The cabin's interior was sparse but clean. A single room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table and chairs, a narrow bed in one corner, and various tools and supplies hanging from the walls. The smell of wood smoke and leather permeated everything. She stood awkwardly by the fire, unsure what to do with herself, when Thomas entered. He moved to a shelf and pulled down a blanket, tossing it to her. "You can sleep by the fire tonight," he said. "There's water in the bucket if you need it, and some bread and dried meat in that tin. I'll be in the barn." "The barn?" Eleanor clutched the blanket. "But this is your home, and you're a lady, despite your circumstances." His dark eyes held hers for a moment. "What's left of your reputation won't survive if anyone learns you spent the night under the same roof as me. Bad enough you rode out here alone with me." The consideration, roughly given though it was, brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. McKenna." He grunted, already turning away. At the door, he paused. "Bar the door behind me. There are wolves in these mountains, and worse things than wolves. Come morning, we'll sort out what's to be done with you." Then he was gone, leaving Eleanor alone in the flickering firelight. She moved to bar the door as instructed, the heavy wooden beam a tangible reminder of the dangers lurking in this untamed land. As she settled onto the floor near the fire, wrapped in the blanket that smelled of tobacco and pine, Eleanor listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness, the howl of wind through the trees, the distant cry of some night creature, the creak and settle of the cabin itself. She had traveled thousands of miles to escape her shame, only to find herself more vulnerable than ever. Tomorrow, Thomas McKenna would likely deposit her back in town like unwanted goods, and she would have to decide whether to spend her last resources returning to a life of disgrace in Boston, or find some other way to survive in this harsh, unforgiving land. But tonight, at least, she was warm and safe, sleeping by a stranger's fire in a cabin at the edge of the world. It wasn't the new beginning she'd hoped for, but perhaps it was a beginning nonetheless. As sleep finally claimed her, Eleanor's last thought was of Thomas McKenna's eyes, dark and unreadable as the mountains themselves, holding secrets she suspected were as painful as her own. Eleanor woke to the sound of wind howling through the pines and something scratching at the cabin door. Her heart hammered as she sat up, the blanket falling from her shoulders. The fire had burned low, casting dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls. The scratching came again, followed by a low whine. Not wolves, then, or at least, not the wild kind. "Just Buck." Thomas's voice came from outside, making her jump. "My dog. Can I come in?" Eleanor hurried to lift the bar, stepping back as Thomas entered, followed by a large, shaggy creature that might generously be called a dog. Buck immediately went to the fireplace, circling 3 times before settling with a contented sigh. "Storm's coming," Thomas said, not looking at her as he added wood to the fire. "Won't be taking you back to town today." Eleanor moved to the small window, peering out at the sky. Dark clouds were indeed massing over the peaks, and the wind had picked up considerably. "How long?" "Could be days." He straightened, brushing bark from his hands. "These early winter storms are unpredictable. Seen them dump 3 feet of snow overnight." The implications hit her like a physical blow. Days, alone with this stranger, cut off from civilization. "But I can't. It isn't proper." Thomas gave her a look that might have been amused if his face weren't so stern. "Proper went out the window the moment you stepped on that stagecoach, Miss Whitfield. Now we deal with what is, not what should be." He moved to the shelves, pulling down supplies. "Can you cook?" "Of course I can cook." Indignation sharpened her tone. "I'm not completely useless. Never said you were." He set a sack of flour and some dried beans on the table. "Just figuring out how we're going to manage. 2 mouths to feed instead of 1 changes things." Eleanor approached the table, examining the supplies. It was basic fare, but she'd worked with less in the boarding house where she'd lived in Boston. "I can make biscuits, if you have lard. Bean soup, perhaps. Don't get fancy. Simple fills bellies just as well." But there was something like approval in his eyes as he watched her take inventory. They worked in relative silence as the storm built outside. Eleanor mixed and kneaded biscuit dough while Thomas tended to his animals, bringing in extra firewood and securing the shutters. By the time he returned, she had biscuits browning in the Dutch oven and beans simmering with what dried meat she could find. "Smells good," he admitted, warming his hands by the fire. Snow dusted his shoulders and clung to his beard. "It's nothing special." Eleanor wiped her hands on the rough apron she'd found hanging by the stove. "Though I suppose you're not accustomed to home cooking. Not for some years." His expression darkened, and Eleanor sensed she'd touched on something painful. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the wind battering the cabin walls. Eleanor tried not to stare at her companion, but found her eyes drawn to him nonetheless. He ate methodically, efficiently, like someone accustomed to viewing meals as fuel rather than pleasure. "You lived here long?" she finally asked, unable to bear the silence. 7 years. And before that, he set down his spoon, fixing her with that unreadable stare. "Before that is none of your concern." Eleanor flushed but refused to be cowed. "If I'm to be stranded here with you, I think I have a right to know something about my host. You want my story?" His laugh was bitter. "Fine. I came here to get away from people and their questions. Built this cabin with my own hands, live off what I hunt and trap. Sometimes I guide hunters from town, trade pelts for supplies. That's all you need to know." "That's all you choose to tell," Eleanor countered. "There's a difference." Buck lifted his head, whining softly, and Thomas's harsh expression softened slightly as he reached down to scratch the dog's ears. "Smart woman. Too smart to be heading west to marry a stranger. Sometimes smart women run out of smart choices." Something in her tone must have resonated with him, because his shoulders relaxed fractionally. "Fair enough." The rest of the day passed slowly. Eleanor busied herself with small tasks, mending a torn shirt she found, organizing the chaotic shelves. Anything to keep her hands occupied and her mind from dwelling on her predicament. Thomas worked on repairing various tools and checking his traps from the doorway when the wind died down enough to see. As darkness fell and the storm intensified, the temperature plummeted. Eleanor found herself shivering despite the fire, her thin dress offering little protection against the mountain cold. "Here." Thomas thrust a bundle at her, a heavy wool shirt and a pair of worn trousers. "They'll swim on you, but they're warm." Eleanor stared at the clothes, scandalized. "I couldn't possibly." "You can and you will, unless you prefer freezing to death over offending your Eastern sensibilities." He turned his back. "I won't look." With trembling fingers, Eleanor changed into the oversized garments. The shirt fell nearly to her knees, and she had to roll the trouser legs several times, but the warmth was immediate and welcome. "Better?" Thomas asked, still facing away. "Yes, thank you." The words came out smaller than she intended. He turned back, and something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or something softer. "You look like a child playing dress-up." "I feel ridiculous. Ridiculous but warm. Out here, that's what matters." He moved to add another log to the fire, then paused. "I'll be in the barn again tonight." "Mr. McKenna, Thomas." His name felt strange on her tongue. "The storm. Surely it's too dangerous. I've slept in worse places in worse weather." He whistled for Buck, who rose reluctantly from his warm spot. "Bar the door. I'll knock come morning." But Eleanor couldn't let him leave. not into that howling darkness. This is foolish. The cabin is small, yes, but we're both adults. We can share the space without impropriety. It's not about propriety anymore. His voice was rough. It's about trust. You don't know me. Miss Whitfield don't know what kind of man I am or what I might do. I know you gave up your home to a stranger. I know you're about to spend a night in a freezing barn to protect what's left of my reputation. She met his eyes steadily. I think I know enough. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the firelit room. Outside, the storm raged, but inside, the silence was complete. Finally, Thomas sighed. I'll sleep by the door. You keep the fire. And Miss Whitfield? His expression was deadly serious. I'm trusting you too. Don't make me regret it. He settled onto the floor near the door, using his coat as a pillow, Buck curling up beside him. Eleanor returned to her spot by the fire, wrapping herself in the blanket, hyper-aware of every sound he made. Thomas? She whispered into the darkness. What? Why did you really come here? To the mountains? Silence stretched so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, so quietly she almost missed it. Same reason you got on that stagecoach. I imagine sometimes a person needs to disappear. Eleanor pulled the blanket tighter, understanding flooding through her. They were both refugees, in their way, both running from pasts too painful to face. What was her name? She asked softly. Your wife? She heard him shift, perhaps in surprise. What makes you think? The way you said not for some years about home cooking. The way you look sometimes, like you're seeing ghosts. She paused. I recognized the expression. Another long silence. Margaret. Her name was Margaret. Was she beautiful? She was kind. His voice held a world of loss. In the end, that mattered more. Eleanor closed her eyes, thinking of all the unkindness she'd faced, all the harsh words and harsher judgments. Yes, she whispered. I suppose it would. Neither spoke again, but the silence felt different now, less strained, more companionable. The storm continued its assault on the cabin, but inside, two wounded souls shared a fragile peace. As Eleanor drifted toward sleep, she thought about the strange turns life could take. She'd come west seeking a new life with a stranger, only to find herself sheltering with a different stranger entirely. Yet, somehow, despite the impropriety and uncertainty, she felt safer than she had in months. The fire crackled softly, casting warm light over Thomas's sleeping form. Even in rest, he looked guarded, one hand resting on the rifle beside him. Whatever had driven him to these mountains had left its mark, just as her own past had marked her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, decisions about her future. The journey back to town when the storm cleared, the harsh realities of survival in a land that didn't forgive weakness. But tonight, she was warm and fed, and not alone. It wasn't the new beginning she'd planned, but perhaps it was enough. The wind howled through the pines, snow piled against the windows, and in a small cabin at the edge of the world, two strangers began the slow, careful process of becoming something more. The storm cleared after 3 days, leaving the world transformed beneath a pristine blanket of snow. Eleanor stood at the cabin window, marveling at how the harsh landscape could be made so beautiful, when Thomas appeared beside her. Trails should be passable by tomorrow, he said. I'll take you to town then. Eleanor nodded, though something in her chest tightened at the thought. The past days had fallen into an unexpected rhythm, cooking together, sharing meals, long evenings by the fire where Thomas taught her to mend traps while she told him stories of Boston. Not intimate, exactly, but comfortable in a way she hadn't anticipated. I'll need to sell some of my needlework, she said, to pay for lodging until I can find employment. Thomas frowned. What needlework? Eleanor retrieved her carpet bag, pulling out several embroidered handkerchiefs and a half-finished sampler. It's not much, but the quality is good. Surely someone in town might... May I? He took one of the handkerchiefs, examining the delicate stitching with surprising care. This is fine work. Too fine for Carson's Creek. People everywhere appreciate beautiful things, Eleanor said, though she heard the uncertainty in her own voice. You haven't met the people of Carson's Creek. He handed back the handkerchief. But we'll try. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Eleanor dressed in her own clothes, now clean and mended, trying not to think about how thin they felt after days in Thomas's warm woolens. He'd already saddled his horse and a sturdy mule he'd borrowed from somewhere. You know how to ride? He asked. I've ridden, though not like this. She gestured at the mule's lack of a side saddle. Another Eastern sensibility you'll need to abandon. But he helped her mount with unexpected gentleness, adjusting the stirrups to accommodate her shorter legs. The journey to town took twice as long as their original ride, the snow making the trail treacherous. Eleanor concentrated on staying balanced, trying not to notice how Thomas kept glancing back to check on her. Carson's Creek looked even smaller under its coating of snow, smoke rising from chimneys the only sign of life. As they rode down Main Street, curtains twitched and faces appeared in windows. The vultures are gathering, Thomas muttered. They stopped first at the general store. Thomas helped Eleanor dismount, then surprised her by following her inside. The proprietor, a thin man with suspicious eyes, barely glanced at her needlework. Don't need any fancy work here, he said. Women in town do their own sewing. Perhaps as gifts, Eleanor began. Said no. His eyes shifted to Thomas. McKenna, heard you took in the Morrison woman. Gave her shelter from the storm, nothing more. That's not what folks are saying. Thomas stepped forward, and something in his posture made the proprietor retreat. Then folks should mind their own business. They tried the dress shop next, with similar results. The proprietress, Mrs. Abernathy, at least pretended to examine Eleanor's work before refusing. It's lovely, dear, but my customers prefer simpler styles, perhaps in Denver or San Francisco. She leaned in conspiratorially. You know, there might be other ways for a woman like you to earn money. The saloon is always looking for. That's enough. Thomas's voice cut like ice. Come on, Miss Whitfield. Outside, Eleanor fought back tears of frustration. I'm not too proud for honest work. Any honest work. But they won't even give me a chance. It's not about your work. Thomas guided her away from the curious stares. It's about what you represent. You're an outsider, a mail-order bride without a husband. To them, you're either a curiosity or a threat. A threat? How could I possibly... Her words were cut off by a commotion near the church. A small crowd had gathered, their voices raised in excitement or anger. Thomas frowned, steering Eleanor closer. Bringing shame on this whole town, a woman's shrill voice carried over the crowd. Bad enough we have to tolerate the saloon girls, but now we're harboring abandoned brides. Now, Mrs. Henderson. The Reverend, a mild-looking man with thinning hair, tried to interject. Christian charity demands. Christian charity doesn't extend to women of low moral character. Reverend Morse. Mrs. Henderson, a formidable woman with iron-gray hair and a face like curdled milk, turned to address the crowd. Mark my words. Allowing such elements will only attract more of the same. Before we know it, Carson's Creek will be another Sodom and Gomorrah. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. Without thinking, she stepped forward. Excuse me. The crowd turned, and Mrs. Henderson's eyes glittered with malicious triumph. Well, speak of the devil. Come to defend yourself. Have you? I've come to sell my needlework, nothing more. Eleanor kept her voice steady despite her racing heart. I'm seeking honest employment, not charity. Honest women don't travel across the country to marry strangers. Someone called out. And they certainly don't take up residence with mountain men. Mrs. Henderson added, her gaze sliding meaningfully to Thomas. I gave her shelter during a storm. Thomas said quietly, as any Christian would. 3 nights of shelter, from what we hear. Mrs. Henderson's implication was clear. Eleanor felt something snap inside her. All the humiliation, all the unfairness, crystallized into pure anger. You know nothing about me, madam. Nothing about what drove me here or what I've endured. You sit in judgment with your comfortable lives and your narrow minds, but you know nothing of desperation or survival. How dare you? I dare because I have nothing left to lose. Eleanor's voice rose. You've already condemned me, labeled me, dismissed me. What more can you take? My dignity, my hope. Those were stripped away long before I reached your precious town. The crowd had grown silent, shocked by her outburst. Even Thomas seemed taken aback. Reverend Morse stepped forward. Miss Whitfield? Eleanor Whitfield? Miss Whitfield, perhaps we could speak privately. No, Mrs. Henderson hadn't finished. We don't need to hear whatever sob story she's peddling. Reverend, I demand you use your influence to see this. This woman removed from our town before she corrupts. The sound of the slap echoed off the wooden buildings. Eleanor stared at her stinging palm, hardly believing what she'd done. Mrs. Henderson stood frozen, hand pressed to her reddening cheek, mouth open in shock. I may be many things, Eleanor said quietly, but I will not stand here and be called corrupt by a woman who's never faced a hardship greater than a burnt roast. Thomas's hand closed around her arm. Time to go. He guided her through the stunned crowd, back to where they'd left the animals. Eleanor's hands shook as he helped her mount. That was foolish, he said, but there was something like admiration in his eyes. That was necessary. Though now that the anger was fading, Eleanor felt sick. I've just made everything worse, haven't I? Probably. He swung up onto his horse. But it was quite a sight. Don't think anyone's ever slapped Constance Henderson before. They were halfway back to the mountain trail when hoofbeats sounded behind them. Thomas's hand went to his rifle, but it was only Reverend Morse, red-faced from the exertion of catching up. Miss Whitfield, Mr. McKenna, please, wait. They stopped, and the Reverend drew alongside, breathing heavily. Miss Whitfield, I must apologize for Mrs. Henderson. She's passionate about preserving the moral character of our town. She's a hypocrite and a gossip, Eleanor said flatly. The Reverend winced, but didn't argue. Be that as it may, I wanted to offer, that is, my wife and I would be willing to provide you with lodging, temporary, of course, until you can make other arrangements. Eleanor studied him, looking for the catch. In exchange for what? Well, my wife could use help with the church cleaning and her charity work. It wouldn't pay much, but with room and board, it was a lifeline. And they all knew it. Eleanor glanced at Thomas, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. That's very kind. Reverend, I accept. Relief flooded the man's face. Excellent. Can you come tomorrow? I'll need to prepare my wife, smooth things over after today's excitement. After he'd ridden off, Eleanor turned to Thomas. Why would he risk his reputation to help me? Josiah Morse is one of the few decent people in that town. His wife, too, though she's quiet about it. Thomas's expression was unreadable. You'll be safe with them. They completed the ride in silence. Back at the cabin, Eleanor began gathering her few belongings, trying not to think about how empty the small space would feel without Thomas's steady presence. You stood up for me today, she said suddenly. Why? Thomas paused in cleaning his rifle. Didn't like what they were saying. But you don't even know me. Not really. He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, I know enough. Know you're brave enough to cross a continent for a new life. Strong enough to face disappointment without breaking. Proud enough to slap Constance Henderson when she deserved it. And foolish enough to ruin any chance of acceptance in town. Acceptance from those people isn't worth having. He set down the rifle, meeting her eyes. You did right, standing up for yourself. Don't let anyone tell you different. The moment stretched between them, charged with something Eleanor didn't dare name. Then Thomas cleared his throat, looking away. I'll take you to the parsonage tomorrow afternoon. Give the Reverend time to settle his wife. That night, their last together. Eleanor made the best meal she could from their simple supplies. They ate quietly, but the silence was companionable rather than awkward. Buck seemed to sense the change coming, whining and pressing close to Eleanor's legs. As the fire died low, Thomas spoke. "You'll do well with the Morses, and once you're established, you'll show this town what you're made of." "You sound very certain." "I am." His dark eyes held hers. "You're not the kind to give up. Eleanor Whitfield. It's written all over you." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and something warm bloomed in Eleanor's chest. Tomorrow, she'd leave this cabin, leave him, and start yet another new chapter. But tonight, she wanted to hold on to this, the crackle of the fire, Buck's gentle snoring, and the steady presence of a man who'd shown her more kindness than she'd known in years. "Thank you, Thomas, for everything." He nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude as always. "Just returning a favor. Someone helped me once, when I needed it. Only right to pass it on." Eleanor wondered who had helped him, what had driven him to these mountains. But she didn't ask. Some stories weren't ready to be told. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles to fight in a town that had already made up its mind about her. But she'd faced worse and survived. And somewhere in these past few days, she'd found something she'd thought lost forever, the strength to fight back. The fire burned low. The mountains stood silent sentinel outside, and two souls who'd found unexpected comfort in each other's company prepared to part ways, neither quite ready to admit how much they'd come to depend on these stolen moments of peace. 2 months had passed since Eleanor took up residence at the parsonage. The small room behind the church was sparse but clean, and Mrs. Morse, Ruth, had proven to be a quiet ally in a town that still viewed Eleanor with suspicion. "You're getting better," Thomas observed, watching Eleanor lower the rifle. The tin can she'd been aiming at spun off the fence post, joining 3 others on the ground. "I had a good teacher." She handed the weapon back, their fingers brushing in the exchange. These Sunday afternoons had become routine. After church services, Thomas would appear at the edge of town, and they'd ride out to a sheltered valley where he taught her to shoot, to read animal tracks, to find water in dry stream beds. "Skills a Eastern lady would never need," he'd said, "but that a Western woman couldn't survive without—" "Try the Colt now," he said, offering the heavy pistol. Eleanor had grown comfortable with its weight, the way it kicked when fired. Her first attempts had been disasters, shots going wild, the recoil nearly knocking her down. Now she hit more than she missed. "Why are you doing this?" she'd asked during their first lesson. "You slapped Constance Henderson," he'd replied, as if that explained everything. Woman with that kind of fire needs to know how to back it up. The truth was more complex. Eleanor suspected. In the months since their first meeting, she'd glimpsed the man beneath the mountain hermit exterior. Thomas McKenna was educated, well-read, with hands that could craft delicate snares as easily as they could skin a bear. Whatever had driven him to isolation had not erased the gentleman underneath. "Better," he said as she placed 5 of 6 shots on target. "You're anticipating the recoil less." "Ruth," says Mrs. Henderson, "still speaks of having me run out of town." "Let her talk. Josiah Morse has more influence than she thinks. And you've proven useful to the church." He paused, reloading the rifle. "Besides, half the town's warming to you. Saw Jacob Miller tip his hat yesterday." It was true. Eleanor's hard work at the church, her skill with the needle and thread that she now used to mend clothing for miners' families, her refusal to be cowed by gossip, all had slowly earned a grudging respect from some quarters. "Only half?" she teased, enjoying the way his mouth quirked almost into a smile. "The other half's waiting to see if you'll survive winter." His expression sobered. "Speaking of which, we need to work on your cold weather skills. Temperature's been dropping steady." They spent the remaining daylight hours on practical matters: how to bank a fire to last through the night, which plants remained edible beneath snow, how to recognize signs of frostbite. Eleanor absorbed it all, hungry for knowledge that might mean survival. As the sun touched the mountain peaks, painting them gold and crimson, Thomas helped her pack the supplies. Their partnership had evolved into something comfortable, familiar, yet still charged with unspoken possibility. "Same time next week?" Eleanor asked, though she knew the answer. "Weather permitting." He hesitated, then added, "There's talk of early snow, real snow, not the dustings we've had. Might be the last chance for lessons until spring." The thought of months without these afternoons, without his steady presence and dry humor, sat heavy in Eleanor's chest. "Then we'd better make the most of the time we have." Something flickered in his dark eyes. "Yes, we'd better." The ride back to town was quiet, both lost in thought. At the parsonage, Thomas dismounted to help her down, his hands lingering on her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Eleanor." Her name came out rough. "If you ever need anything, if there's trouble, I know where to find you." She looked up at him, this man who'd become her anchor in a hostile land. "Thank you, Thomas, for everything." He touched the brim of his hat and rode away, a silhouette against the dying light. Eleanor watched until he disappeared into the tree line, then turned to find Ruth Morse watching from the doorway. "He's a good man," Ruth said quietly. "Yes." Eleanor moved past her, not trusting herself to say more. 3 days later, Thomas's prediction proved accurate. Eleanor woke to a world transformed. Snow falling so thick she couldn't see across the churchyard. By noon, drifts reached the windows. "We're snowed in proper," Ruth announced, returning from a failed attempt to reach the woodshed. "Haven't seen a storm like this in years." They rationed wood, keeping only the kitchen stove burning. Eleanor helped Ruth with an endless stream of mending, their needles flashing by lamplight as the storm raged outside. On the second day, when they'd burned the last chair for warmth, rescue came in the form of pounding on the door. "Josiah!" Ruth flew to open it, then gasped. Thomas stood in the doorway, more ice than man, dragging a sledge piled with firewood. Behind him, barely visible through the snow, Eleanor glimpsed more men with supplies. "Figured you'd be running low," he said through chattering teeth, while Ruth fussed over the half-frozen reverend, who'd apparently been part of the rescue party. Eleanor helped Thomas stack wood by the stove. His hands were so cold they couldn't grip properly, and she found herself covering them with her own, trying to restore warmth. "You could have died," she whispered fiercely. "Coming out in this, town takes care of its own." His eyes met hers. All of them. The men didn't stay, others needed help, but Thomas's words echoed long after he'd vanished back into the storm. She was part of the town now, whether everyone accepted it or not. The blizzard broke after 4 days, leaving Carson's Creek buried beneath 6 feet of snow. What followed was a flurry of activity as the town dug out, neighbors helping neighbors, old grudges temporarily forgotten in the face of shared adversity. Eleanor threw herself into the effort, helping distribute the supplies Thomas and others had risked their lives to deliver. She worked alongside women who'd snubbed her, tended children whose mothers had called her shameful, and slowly, gradually, the walls began to crumble. "You're stronger than you look," Mrs. Miller admitted, watching Eleanor haul another bucket of snow to melt for water. "The West has a way of teaching strength," Eleanor replied, thinking of Thomas's lessons, of everything she'd learned about survival. It was 2 weeks before the roads cleared enough for travel beyond town. Eleanor was hanging laundry in the weak winter sun. Ruth's old clothesline method worked even in freezing weather, when she spotted a familiar figure on horseback. Thomas looked tired, she thought as he approached. The storm and its aftermath had taken a toll on everyone, but those who'd led the rescue efforts bore it most. "Brought you something," he said without preamble, producing a wrapped bundle. Inside was a heavy wool cloak, fur-lined and beautifully made. Eleanor ran her fingers over the soft rabbit fur, speechless. "Can't have you freezing in that thin eastern coat," he said gruffly. "Winter's just starting." "Thomas, I can't. This must have cost—" "Trapped the rabbits myself. Mrs. Chen at the trading post did the sewing in exchange for fresh meat." He shifted in the saddle, uncomfortable with her gratitude. It's practical. Nothing more. But Eleanor knew better. Knew the hours he'd spent trapping enough rabbits, the care in choosing fur that matched, the perfect fit that meant he'd paid attention to her size. This was more than practical. It was a declaration, quiet but unmistakable. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Thank you." He nodded, gathering his reins. "Spring seems a long way off," he said carefully. "But it'll come. Always does." "Yes," Eleanor agreed, understanding the promise beneath the words. "And when it does, maybe things will be different. Maybe a man who's been hiding in the mountains might find reasons to come down more often." Eleanor's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. "And maybe a woman who's proven she can survive winter might be brave enough to venture up the mountain." This time, his smile was real, transforming his weathered face. Maybe so. He touched his hat and rode off, leaving Eleanor clutching the cloak and wondering how she'd survive the long months until spring. But she would survive. Thomas had taught her that. And when the snow melted and the world came alive again, perhaps they'd both be ready for whatever came next. That night, wrapped in her new cloak by the stove, Eleanor pulled out paper and pen. She had a letter to write, not east to Boston, but to a land office in Denver. If she was going to build a life here, really build it, she needed more than charity and borrowed rooms. Ruth found her there hours later, surrounded by sketches and plans. "What's all this?" "My future," Eleanor said firmly. "I'm going to file a homestead claim. Single women can do that here. I checked. A small cabin, maybe some chickens, a garden when the ground thaws. That's hard living for a woman alone." Eleanor smiled, thinking of a certain mountain man in Sunday afternoon lessons. "I won't be alone. Not really." Ruth studied her face, then nodded slowly. "No, I don't suppose you will be." Outside, snow began to fall again, but Eleanor wasn't afraid. She'd faced worse storms than this and emerged stronger. And somewhere in the mountains, she knew Thomas was watching the same snowfall, perhaps thinking of spring and the possibilities it might bring. The cloak lay warm across her shoulders, smelling faintly of pine smoke and wilderness. It felt like a promise, like hope, like the first step toward a future she was only beginning to imagine. Winter would be long and hard, but Eleanor Whitfield had learned to be patient. After all, the best things were worth waiting for. The blizzard struck without warning on a moonless February night. Eleanor had been reading by the stove when the wind suddenly rose from a whisper to a shriek, rattling the windows of the small cabin she'd recently claimed as her own. She'd moved from the parsonage just after Christmas, her homestead claim approved and a modest dwelling hastily constructed before the worst of winter set in. Thomas had helped, along with several townsmen who'd warmed to her industrious spirit. The cabin was small but sturdy, a single room with a loft, situated halfway between town and Thomas's mountain refuge. Now, as the storm intensified, Eleanor wondered if she'd been foolish to insist on independence. The fire flickered as wind found every tiny gap in the chinking, and she could hear the ominous crack of tree branches breaking under the weight of snow and ice. A sudden pounding at the door made her heart leap. Who would be out in this weather? She grabbed the rifle Thomas had given her, a Christmas gift. He'd said, purely practical, and approached cautiously. "Eleanor, open up!" "Thomas!" She flew to the door, struggling against the wind to pull it open. He stumbled inside, half carrying a smaller figure wrapped in furs. "Found him on the trail," Thomas gasped, ice crusting his beard. "Horse threw him. Think his legs broke." Eleanor helped maneuver the injured man to her bed. As Thomas unwrapped the furs, she gasped. It was Daniel Morrison, Samuel's younger brother, come from California to settle his brother's affairs. "Didn't know where else to take him," Thomas said, already working to remove the man's frozen boots. "Town's too far in this storm, and my cabin." He trailed off, but Eleanor understood. Thomas's Spartan quarters were no place for an injured man. They worked together with practiced efficiency, a partnership born of months of shared experience. while Eleanor heated water and gathered medical supplies. Thomas carefully examined the leg. "Clean break," he announced. "Needs setting." Daniel Morrison moaned, drifting in and out of consciousness. He was younger than his brother had been, perhaps 30, with sandy hair and what would have been pleasant features if not twisted in pain. "Hold him steady," Thomas instructed. Eleanor braced the man's shoulders as Thomas set the bone with a quick, decisive movement. Daniel's scream was mercifully brief before he passed out entirely. "He'll need watching," Thomas said, fashioning a splint from kindling and torn sheets. "Fever's likely, with the cold he took." Eleanor nodded, already mentally cataloging her supplies. "I'll manage." "Not alone, you won't." Thomas's tone brooked no argument. "I'm staying." The implications hung between them, a unmarried man and woman, alone together through the night, but with the storm raging and a life hanging in the balance. Propriety seemed a distant concern. They settled into a careful rhythm. Eleanor tended the patient while Thomas kept the fire stoked and melted endless buckets of snow for water. When Daniel's fever spiked near midnight, they worked side by side, cooling his burning skin with damp cloths. "You're good at this," Thomas observed, watching her gentle efficiency. "I nursed my mother through her final illness." Eleanor didn't look up from her task. "It's how I learned that kindness can matter more than beauty, as you once said about your Margaret." Thomas's hands stilled. They'd never spoken of his wife since that first night in his cabin. "You remembered—" "I remember everything you tell me." The admission slipped out before she could stop it. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind's howl and Daniel's labored breathing. Then Thomas moved closer, taking the cloth from her hands. "You need a rest. I'll watch him for a while." But Eleanor couldn't sleep. She sat by the fire, acutely aware of Thomas's presence, the way the firelight caught in his dark hair, the gentle competence of his hands as he tended their patient. This was dangerous territory, this forced intimacy, yet she couldn't bring herself to wish it away. Near dawn, Daniel's fever broke. He opened clear eyes, confusion giving way to pain as he tried to move. "Easy," Thomas said. "You've got a broken leg and a story that'll impress the ladies. Miss Whitfield here saved your life." "Miss Whitfield?" Daniel's gaze found Eleanor. "You're the one who was supposed to marry Sam." "Yes." Eleanor straightened, prepared for judgment, but Daniel only nodded weakly. "He wrote about you, said you sounded like a sensible woman. I'm sorry you traveled so far for nothing." "Not for nothing," Eleanor said softly, her eyes finding Thomas across the room. "I found a new life here." The storm blew itself out by midday, leaving crystal blue skies and mountainous drifts. Thomas fashioned a sledge to transport Daniel to town and the doctor's care. As they prepared to leave, Daniel caught Eleanor's hand. "I'll be selling Sam's ranch," he said. "Good piece of land. Already has a cabin and barn. I'd make you a fair price, seeing as you were meant to be family." Eleanor's breath caught. Land of her own. Real land. Not just the small homestead plot. I'd need time to consider. Take all the time you need. I'll be at the hotel for a few weeks yet." His eyes shifted between Eleanor and Thomas, a knowing look passing over his face. "Something tells me you'll want to discuss it with someone." Thomas said nothing during the journey to town, but Eleanor could feel the weight of unspoken thoughts. At the doctor's office, as they settled Daniel into the physician's care, he finally spoke. "It's a good opportunity. Sam's land borders mine to the south." "I know." Eleanor pulled her cloak, his gift, tighter. "Thomas, don't decide anything yet." His voice was rough. "Spring's coming. Everything looks different in spring." But as they stood in the snowy street, something had already shifted. The careful boundaries they'd maintained were blurring, worn thin by a night of shared vigil and the promise of adjoining lands. "Will you come for supper tomorrow?" Eleanor asked impulsively. "I owe you a proper meal after last night." Thomas studied her for a long moment. "That might not be wise. When have we ever chosen wisdom over what's right?" A smile ghosted across his face. "Fair point. Tomorrow." Then, he left her at her cabin with a load of firewood and a warning about another storm coming. Eleanor watched him ride away, then turned to survey her small domain. It wasn't much, yet, but with Samuel Morrison's land, with time and work and perhaps a partner. She shook her head, banishing dangerous dreams. But that night, alone by her fire, she allowed herself to imagine what spring might bring. The image that came was of two people working side by side in the sunshine, building something lasting in this unforgiving land. The next evening, Thomas arrived precisely at sunset. He'd shaved, Eleanor noticed, and worn what appeared to be his best shirt beneath the heavy coat. She'd prepared venison stew from meat he'd brought her the week before, biscuits, light and golden, and had even managed a dried apple pie. "This is fine," he said simply, but his eyes were warm. They ate in comfortable silence at first, the domesticity of the scene both natural and charged with meaning. Finally, Eleanor gathered her courage. "I'm going to buy Samuel's land." Thomas set down his spoon carefully. "That's a big decision." "Yes." She met his eyes steadily. "But I'm not the frightened girl who arrived on that stagecoach anymore. This place has changed me. You've changed me." "Eleanor, no, let me finish." She stood, pacing to the window where snow was beginning to fall again. "I know what people will say. An unmarried woman, taking on that much land. They'll expect me to fail." "You won't fail." She turned at the certainty in his voice. "How can you be so sure?" Thomas rose, crossing to stand before her. For the first time since she'd known him, he reached out deliberately, taking her hands in his larger ones. "Because you're the strongest woman I've ever known. Because you've already survived everything this land has thrown at you. Because—" He stopped, struggling with words. "Because," Eleanor prompted, her heart racing. "Because you won't be alone." The words came out in a rush. "Not if you don't want to be. I know I'm not what you came here looking for. I'm no Samuel Morrison with his respectable ranch and clean past. But Eleanor, these months since you arrived have been the best of my life." She finished softly. His hands tightened on hers. "I've been dead inside since Margaret passed, frozen, like these mountains in winter. Then you showed up at my door, all pride and fire despite your circumstances, and something started to thaw." Eleanor reached up, touching his weathered cheek. "Thomas McKenna, are you trying to court me?" "I'm trying to tell you that if you buy that land, you'll have a neighbor who's very interested in your success. And maybe, come spring—" He pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. "Maybe we could talk about making it more than neighboring." "I don't want to wait for spring," Eleanor whispered. The kiss was inevitable as sunrise, soft at first, then deeper as months of careful restraint fell away. When they finally parted, both breathing unsteadily, Thomas cupped her face in his hands. "You sure about this? I'm not an easy man. Eleanor, the mountains are in my blood now. I'll never be completely civilized. I don't want civilized." She covered his hands with her own. "I want real. I want honest. I want the man who taught me to shoot and build fires and survive, the man who risked his life to bring firewood to strangers in a blizzard." "Then you have him." His smile was radiant. "For whatever that's worth." Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside Eleanor's little cabin, spring had already arrived. They talked long into the night, making plans, practical ones about land and livestock and building, dreaming ones about the future they'd create together. When Thomas finally prepared to leave, propriety still had some hold. Despite everything, Eleanor walked him to the door. "I'll speak to Daniel Morrison tomorrow," she said. And then we start building something worth having." He kissed her once more, a promise sealed. Together, as his figure disappeared into the swirling snow, Eleanor pressed her fingers to her lips, still feeling the warmth of his kiss. She'd traveled across a continent seeking respectability and security with a stranger. Instead, she'd found something far more precious, a love built on mutual respect, forged in hardship, and strong enough to weather any storm. The fire crackled cheerfully as she prepared for bed, and Eleanor smiled. Let the winter rage outside. She carried spring in her heart now, and nothing, not gossip, not hardship, not all the bitter cold of the mountains, could steal that warmth away. The news arrived on a brilliant March morning when Eleanor was feeding her new chickens. A rider from town, dusty and urgent, bearing a message that made her blood run cold. "Thomas McKenna's been arrested," the young man panted. "Sheriff's holding him on assault charges. The Morrison family's pressing claims. They're saying you belong to them by rights, being Sam's intended and all." Eleanor's hands shook as she read the hastily scrawled note from Reverend Morse. Daniel Morrison, it seemed, had changed his tune about selling the land. His uncle from back east had arrived, a judge with connections and rigid ideas about property rights. They claimed that since Eleanor had traveled west as Samuel's bride, she was essentially family property, and her association with Thomas was both scandalous and illegal. "They're saying Mr. McKenna kidnapped you," the messenger added. "That he's been keeping you against your will. That's absurd." Eleanor's mind raced. "When's the hearing?" "Tomorrow noon. Judge Morrison, that's the uncle. He's pushing for a quick trial." Eleanor pressed coins into the boy's hand and sent him away, then sank onto her porch steps. The happiness of the past weeks crumbled around her. She and Thomas had been careful, maintaining propriety even as they planned their future. But in a town where perception mattered more than truth, their growing closeness had been twisted into something sinister. She hitched her horse with trembling fingers. The ride to town had never seemed longer, each hoofbeat echoing her racing heart. The streets were unusually busy, clusters of people whispering and staring as she passed. News traveled fast in Carson's Creek. The jail was a small stone building behind the sheriff's office. Sheriff Watson, a fair-minded man usually, looked uncomfortable as Eleanor demanded to see Thomas. "I can't allow that. Miss Whitfield, Judge Morrison's orders. No visitors until after the hearing." "This is preposterous. On what grounds?" "On the grounds that you might be under undue influence." A smooth voice interrupted from the doorway. Eleanor turned to face a man who could only be Judge Morrison, tall, silver-haired, with the same cold eyes as his late nephew but bearing an air of cultivated authority. "Miss Whitfield, I presume?" Eleanor straightened her spine. "Judge Morrison, I demand you release Mr. McKenna immediately. He's done nothing wrong. That remains to be determined." The judge's smile was predatory. "You see, my dear nephew's letters painted quite a picture of the future he'd planned. A respectable marriage, a thriving ranch, children to carry on the Morrison name. When he died, those plans didn't simply vanish. I'm not property to be inherited. No, but you are a woman who accepted money, the stage fare, under certain expectations. My nephew Daniel was prepared to honor his brother's commitment, take you as his wife, give you the life you traveled here to find." His eyes hardened. "Instead, we find you've been corrupted by a mountain hermit with a questionable past." "How dare you? Did you know, Miss Whitfield, that Thomas McKenna killed his own brother-in-law?" The judge's words fell like stones. "Oh yes, I've done my research. 7 years ago in Denver, claims it was self-defense, but the man fled rather than face justice. Hardly the sort of person a respectable woman should associate with." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. Thomas's past, the shadows he carried. Was this the truth of it? But she rallied quickly. "I don't believe you, and even if it were true, it changes nothing. Thomas McKenna is the most honorable man I've ever known." "Honor? Mrs." Henderson's shrill voice carried from the gathering crowd. "An unmarried woman, living alone, visited at all hours by a known killer? Where's the honor in that?" The crowd was growing, their faces a mix of curiosity, judgment, and malicious satisfaction. Eleanor recognized many she'd helped during the winter storms, but mob mentality was taking hold. "I demand to speak at the hearing," Eleanor said firmly. Judge Morrison's smile widened. "Oh, you'll speak, my dear. In fact, your testimony will determine both your futures. Choose wisely." That night was the longest of Eleanor's life. She paced her cabin. Buck, who'd taken to staying with her when Thomas was away, whining anxiously at her distress. Should she flee? Take Thomas's horse and ride for Denver? Find legal help? But leaving would only confirm their suspicions and damn Thomas further. Instead, she planned. By dawn, she had her strategy. The courthouse was packed when Eleanor arrived, wearing her best dress, the one she'd saved for her wedding to Samuel, now pressed into service for a very different purpose. Reverend and Ruth Morse sat in the front row, their faces grave but supportive. Daniel Morrison avoided her eyes, clearly uncomfortable with his uncle's machinations. Thomas sat with the sheriff, his hands bound. Their eyes met across the room, and he shook his head slightly. "Don't sacrifice yourself for me," the gesture said. Eleanor lifted her chin. He should know her better by now. Judge Morrison called the impromptu court to order, his Eastern authority commanding silence. "We're here to address serious allegations of kidnapping, corruption of morals, and improper conduct. Miss Whitfield, please take the stand." Eleanor moved with deliberate grace to the witness chair. The judge's questions came rapid fire. "You came west to marry Samuel Morrison?" "Yes." "You accepted his financial support for the journey?" "The stage fare?" "Yes." "And upon finding him deceased, you were taken by the accused?" "I was offered shelter during a blizzard." "Shelter that extended far beyond a single night, didn't it?" The judge's tone was silk over steel. "Tell us, Miss Whitfield, about your true relationship with Thomas McKenna." Eleanor took a breath. This was the moment. "Thomas McKenna saved my life. He taught me to survive in this unforgiving land. He showed me kindness when this town offered only judgment." "That doesn't answer, and I love him." The courthouse erupted. Judge Morrison banged for order. His face flushed. "You admit to an improper relationship?" "I admit to loving an honest man who has treated me with nothing but respect and honor." Eleanor's voice carried clear above the noise. "If that's improper, then propriety be damned." "Mrs." Henderson gasped audibly. Judge Morrison leaned forward. "Miss Whitfield, I'm offering you a chance to reclaim your reputation. My nephew Daniel is still willing to marry you, to give you the respectability you came here seeking. All you need do is testify that McKenna took advantage of your vulnerable state." Eleanor looked at Daniel, who had the grace to appear ashamed, then at Thomas, whose dark eyes blazed with a mix of pride and anguish. "No." "I beg your pardon." Eleanor stood, addressing the entire room. "You want the truth? Here it is. I came west running from shame, believing marriage to a stranger was my only salvation. Instead, I found something far more valuable. My own strength. Yes, Thomas McKenna helped me. He taught me to shoot, to build fires, to read the weather and the land. But more than that, he taught me I was worth more than just being some man's property." She turned to Judge Morrison. "You speak of corruption? The only corruption here is yours, trying to force a woman into marriage to satisfy your family's wounded pride. As for Thomas's past, yes, I know about Denver. I know his wife's brother came drunk and violent, blaming Thomas for her death in childbirth. I know Thomas defended himself and left rather than drag his wife's memory through a trial." "You can't know," the judge started. "I can and do, because unlike you, I bothered to seek truth rather than convenient lies." Eleanor pulled a letter from her pocket. "This is from the Denver sheriff, confirming that charges were never formally filed because witnesses testified to self-defense. Thomas McKenna is no criminal, just a man who chose exile over explaining his grief to people who'd already judged him." The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Thomas stared at her in amazement. When had she written to Denver? How had she known? Judge Morrison's face had gone purple. "Regardless of past circumstances, current improprieties?" "What improprieties?" Eleanor challenged. "Yes, Thomas has been courting me. Yes, we've been planning a future together. Last I checked, that wasn't illegal in any territory. Unmarried women don't make plans with men. This one does." Eleanor turned to address the townspeople. "I know what you all think of me. Mail-order bride, fallen woman, Eastern outsider. But I've worked alongside you, nursed your children, mended your clothes. I'm not asking for your approval. I'm demanding your justice. Release Thomas McKenna. He's guilty of nothing but treating a desperate woman with kindness. Reverend Morse stood. "I'd like to speak." Judge Morrison looked ready to refuse, but the crowd's mood had shifted. "Proceed." "I've watched Miss Whitfield these past months," the Reverend said quietly. "I've seen her faith, her determination, her compassion, and I've seen how Thomas McKenna looks at her, with the kind of love that builds families and communities. If we punish them for finding happiness in this harsh land, what does that make us?" "It makes us proper Christians," Mrs. Henderson shrilled, but her support was wavering. "No," Ruth Morse spoke up, surprising everyone. "It makes us hypocrites. How many of us came west to escape judgment? How many found second chances here?" She looked directly at Mrs. Henderson. "Constance, didn't you come here after your first husband's bankruptcy left you destitute? Who are we to deny others the fresh start we ourselves sought?" The tide had turned. Eleanor could feel it in the murmurs, see it in the faces shifting from condemnation to consideration. Judge Morrison sensed it too. "The law," he began, "the law says nothing about forcing women into marriages they don't want." A new voice interrupted. Daniel Morrison stood, facing his uncle. "I withdraw any claims on Miss Whitfield. She owes our family nothing, and frankly, Uncle, Samuel would be ashamed of what you're doing in his name." Judge Morrison's authority crumbled visibly. Sheriff Watson cleared his throat. "Seems to me there's no crime here to prosecute. I'm releasing Mr. McKenna." As the sheriff unlocked Thomas's shackles, Eleanor felt her knees nearly buckle with relief. Then Thomas was there, his arms around her in full view of everyone, and she didn't care what anyone thought. "You magnificent, reckless woman," he murmured against her hair. "Denver? Really? I told you I was stronger than I looked." She pulled back to meet his eyes. "I wasn't losing you to lies and prejudice, not when we've come so far." Judge Morrison pushed past them, his dignity in tatters. The crowd began to disperse, some offering nods of approval, others maintaining their disapproval but lacking the momentum to voice it. Mrs. Henderson approached, her face pinched. "This isn't over. Decent people won't forget." "Constance." Thomas's voice was steel. "Miss Whitfield is going to be my wife. You'll speak of her with respect, or you won't speak of her at all." Eleanor's heart soared even as she protested. "Thomas, you don't have to—" "I'm not proposing out of obligation." He cupped her face gently. "I'm proposing because I can't imagine facing another winter without you. Because you stood in that courtroom and fought for me like no one ever has. Because I love you, Eleanor Whitfield, and I'm done pretending otherwise." "Well then," Eleanor smiled through tears she didn't bother to hide. "Yes." This time, when the courthouse erupted, it was with a mixture of scandalized gasps and genuine applause. Reverend Morse stepped forward, beaming. "I believe we can arrange a ceremony this very afternoon if you'd like. Strike while the iron's hot, as they say." Eleanor looked at Thomas, saw her own joy reflected in his eyes. They'd weathered storms literal and figurative, faced down prejudice and past wounds. What was a hasty wedding compared to that? "Why not?" Thomas said, his rare smile transforming his face. "We've done everything else backwards. Might as well keep the tradition." And so, as the March sun climbed toward noon, Eleanor Whitfield, mail-order bride turned mountain woman, Eastern refugee turned Western fighter, prepared to marry the man who'd shown her that sometimes the best destinations are the ones you never plan to reach. Spring had transformed the mountain valleys into a tapestry of wildflowers and new grass. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the expanded cabin, their cabin now, watching Thomas work with the horses in the corral they'd built together. 3 months of marriage had brought changes neither had fully anticipated, but all of them welcome. "Mrs. McKenna," a voice called from the trail. Eleanor shaded her eyes to see young Timothy Watson, the sheriff's son, riding hard toward them. "What is it, Tim?" The boy slid from his saddle, breathless. "Pa says to come quick. There's trouble. Man came into town this morning, asking about Mr. Thomas. Says he's got business from Denver. Old business." Eleanor's blood chilled. Thomas had already seen the rider and was walking over, his expression guarded. What did this man look like? Thomas asked quietly. Big fellow, dark beard, scar across his left cheek. Pa said to tell you the name's Garrett Walsh. Thomas went very still. Eleanor had never seen him truly afraid, but something like fear flickered in his eyes now. Tell your PA we'll be along directly. After the boy left, Eleanor touched Thomas's arm. Who is Garrett Walsh? Margaret's cousin. His voice was flat. He blamed me for her death, same as her brother did. But where Marcus came at me drunk and wild, Garrett's different, cold, patient. I thought, it's been 7 years. I thought he'd let it go. What does he want? Justice. He'd say, revenge. More like. Thomas moved to the cabin, retrieving his rifle and checking his pistol. I need you to stay here. Eleanor. Absolutely not. She was already reaching for her own weapon. We face things together, remember? That's what marriage means. They rode in tense silence, Thomas scanning the ridgelines as if expecting ambush at any moment. Eleanor had learned to read his moods in their months together, and she'd never seen him this wary. Carson's Creek was subdued when they arrived. Clusters of people speaking in low voices. Sheriff Watson met them outside his office, his weathered face grim. He's in the saloon, Watson said. Came in peaceful enough, but he's been asking questions about you. Thomas says he's been tracking you for years. I'll talk to him. Thomas said, Not alone, you won't. Eleanor's tone brooked no argument. The Liberty Bell Saloon fell silent as they entered. Garrett Walsh sat at a corner table, his back to the wall, a gunfighter's position. He was as Timothy had described, large, bearded, with a scar that pulled his mouth into a permanent sneer. His eyes, cold as winter stone, fixed on Thomas. 7 years. McKenna. Walsh's voice was soft, dangerous. 7 years I've been looking for you. I'm not running anymore. Garrett? Thomas kept his hand away from his gun, but Eleanor could see the tension in his shoulders. What happened with Marcus was self-defense. You know that. I know my cousin died by your hand. Walsh stood slowly, and Eleanor noticed how the saloon patrons edged toward the doors. Margaret was the light of our family. When she died, birthing your child, it broke us. Then you killed Marcus when he sought satisfaction. Marcus came to my home drunk and swinging a knife, Thomas said evenly. He gave me no choice. There's always a choice. Walsh's hand hovered near his holster. You could have faced trial. Instead, you ran like the coward you are. Eleanor stepped forward. My husband is no coward. Walsh's eyes shifted to her, and his scarred mouth twisted further. The new Mrs. McKenna heard about you, the mail-order bride who couldn't find her intended. Settled for a killer instead. I settled for no one. Eleanor said clearly, I chose the best man I've ever known. Then you chose poorly. Walsh's attention returned to Thomas. I've got a proposition for you. McKenna, tomorrow, dawn, the clearing north of town. We settle this like men. Winner walks away free. And if I refuse, then I'll dog your steps for the rest of your life. Your pretty wife will never know a moment's peace, always wondering when I'll come calling. Walsh leaned forward. But I know you. Thomas, you won't let her live that way. You've got too much of that misplaced honor. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then, dawn, the clearing. But when I win, you leave and never return. This ends tomorrow. Walsh smiled. A cold, satisfied expression. When you lose, your widow will know you died paying for your crimes. He strode out, spurs ringing against the floor. The saloon slowly came back to life, whispers rising like wind through grass. Thomas, no! Eleanor gripped his arm. There has to be another way. The sheriff can't arrest a man for challenging another to a fair fight. Sheriff Watson had followed them in. Walsh is smart. He's keeping it legal. That night, Eleanor lay awake in Thomas's arms, memorizing the steady beat of his heart. They'd made love with desperate tenderness, each touch a promise, each kiss a prayer. Now, with dawn approaching, She couldn't stop trembling. "I won't lose you," she whispered fiercely. "Not to his hatred, not to the past. Eleanor," Thomas's voice was gentle. "If something happens, nothing will happen." She pressed closer. "You're going to win. Come home, and we're going to finish building that barn. Our children will play in that meadow where the columbines grow. We'll grow old together. Thomas McKenna. And that's final." He buried his face in her hair. "God, I love you. More than I ever thought possible. You brought me back to life. Eleanor, whatever happens, know that." "Show me tomorrow," she said. "Show me by coming home." Dawn came too soon, painting the mountains blood red. Half the town had gathered at the clearing, morbid curiosity overcoming fear. Eleanor stood with Ruth Morse, her rifle loaded and ready. Though Sheriff Watson had warned against interference, Walsh was already there, checking his weapon with methodical precision. Thomas approached slowly, and Eleanor was struck by how calm he looked, how steady. "Gentlemen," Sheriff Watson called reluctantly, "you know the rules. On my count, turn and fire. First shot or killing shot ends it." The two men stood back to back. Eleanor's hands clenched so tight her nails drew blood. Around her, the crowd held its collective breath. 10 paces, Watson announced. 1. Each step seemed to take forever. Eleanor watched Thomas's profile, saw the focus there, the preparation. 5. Walsh's scarred face was set in grim satisfaction. He'd waited years for this moment. 9. A movement in the crowd caught Eleanor's eye. Daniel Morrison, pushing forward, something urgent in his expression. 10. Turn and stop! Daniel's voice cracked across the clearing. "Sheriff, stop this! I have information!" Watson hesitated. Walsh had already begun his turn, hand moving toward his gun. But Thomas held, waiting. "What information?" Watson demanded. Daniel held up a telegram. "From Denver. About the original incident. I wired for details after the trial. Garrett Walsh, you weren't seeking justice for Margaret. You were Marcus's partner in the land scheme, weren't you? The one where they tried to steal Thomas's ranch while Margaret was dying?" Walsh's face contorted. "Shut your mouth, boy." "It's all here," Daniel continued, louder now. "Witness testimonies. How Marcus and Walsh tried to force Thomas to sign over his property while his wife lay dying. How they threatened the midwife to let Margaret bleed if Thomas didn't comply." The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. Eleanor felt the world tilt. Thomas's face had gone white. "You let her die?" His voice was barely human. "You could have saved her?" "She was dying anyway," Walsh snarled. "The midwife said as much. But you had that prime ranch land, and Marcus needed—" Thomas's roar cut him off. Not the measured control Eleanor knew, but raw, primal rage. He charged across the space between them, gun forgotten. Walsh drew, but Thomas was on him before he could aim. They went down in a tangle of limbs, rolling in the dust. The crowd scattered as the two men fought with desperate violence. "Do something!" Eleanor shouted at Watson, but the sheriff seemed frozen by the revelation. Walsh managed to throw Thomas off, scrambling for his dropped gun. Thomas lunged again, and they wrestled for control of the weapon. A shot rang out, muffled between their bodies. Both men went still. Eleanor was running before conscious thought formed, dropping to her knees beside them. Thomas rolled away from Walsh, blood on his shirt. But it was Walsh who lay still, eyes staring sightlessly at the dawn sky, a spreading red stain across his chest. "Thomas!" Eleanor's hand searched for wounds, found the graze across his ribs. "You're hurt! I'm alive!" He caught her hands, his eyes blazing with a mix of grief and fury. "All these years, I blamed myself, thought if I'd been a better husband, stronger, she might have lived, but they let her die." Sheriff Watson finally moved, kneeling to check Walsh's pulse. "Dead. Self-defense. Clear as day. Everyone saw him draw first. The midwife," Thomas said urgently. "Sarah Hensley, she left town right after Margaret died. Said she couldn't bear to stay. But she was threatened." "We'll find her," Watson promised. Get her statement. If what Morrison says is true, this changes everything about what happened 7 years ago." Eleanor helped Thomas to his feet, supporting him as the crowd parted before them. Some faces showed shock, others sympathy. Even Mrs. Henderson looked shaken by the morning's revelations. "Take me home," Thomas said quietly. "Please." They rode slowly, Thomas leaning against Eleanor despite his protests that the wound wasn't serious. Back at their cabin, she cleaned and bandaged the graze with hands that only trembled slightly. "Talk to me," she said softly when he'd been silent too long. "I don't know what to feel." Thomas stared at his hands. "For 7 years, I've carried the guilt of Margaret's death, made it part of me, shaped my life around it. Now, to find out that you were betrayed by those who should have helped, that your guilt was misplaced." Eleanor took his face in her hands. "Thomas, this doesn't diminish your love for Margaret or your grief, but maybe now you can finally let go of the blame. She might have lived." His voice broke. "Our child might have lived, or they might not have. Birth is dangerous even with the best help." Eleanor's own eyes filled with tears. "But what we know for certain is that you loved her. You fought for her. And when violence came, you defended yourself. There's no shame in any of that." Thomas pulled her close, and she felt him shake with the long-suppressed sobs. She held him as the sun climbed higher, as the morning birds began their songs, as 7 years of festering guilt finally began to drain away. Later, as Thomas slept, exhausted by emotion and blood loss, Eleanor stood on their porch looking out at the mountains. The past would always be with them. Margaret's ghost, the violence that had shaped Thomas's exile, the long road that had brought Eleanor west, but it no longer had the power to destroy their future. Ruth Morse came by at midday with food and news. "Daniel Morrison's been busy. He's got the territorial marshal involved now." Turns out Walsh and Marcus had pulled similar schemes in other towns. Thomas might even have claim to compensation. "We don't want money," Eleanor said. "Just peace. Sometimes justice brings its own peace." Ruth studied her friend. "How is he?" "Sleeping, processing. It's a lot to take in." Eleanor managed a small smile. "But he's strong. We both are. We'll get through this." That evening, Thomas emerged from the cabin, moving stiffly but with clearer eyes than Eleanor had ever seen. He found her in the garden she'd started, coaxing vegetables from the mountain soil. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For standing by me. For being my anchor when the past tried to drown me." He knelt beside her, heedless of his injury. "For showing me that life after loss is possible." Eleanor cupped his face, thumbs brushing away the last traces of dried tears. "That's what partners do." "In all weather, remember? In all weather," he agreed, and kissed her there among the new growth. The setting sun painting the mountains gold. The future spreading before them like an unwritten map. The past had been faced. The ghosts lay to rest. Now, finally, they could build their life on truth instead of shadows. Love instead of guilt. Hope instead of exile. The mountains stood eternal around them, witnesses to pain and joy alike, and in their shelter, 2 wounded souls continued the long, sweet work of healing. The autumn of 1871 painted the Colorado mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Eleanor stood at the window of their expanded cabin, one hand resting on her rounded belly, watching Thomas and the hired hands bring in the last of the harvest. Their first full year on the combined ranch had exceeded all expectations. Samuel Morrison's land, merged with Thomas's mountain territory, created a sprawling, prosperous homestead. "You should be resting," Ruth Morse said from behind her, setting down a basket of fresh bread and preserves. "I've been resting all morning," Eleanor protested. "Sarah says movement is good for the baby." Sarah Hensley, the midwife who delivered Margaret years ago, had returned to Carson's Creek after the truth about Walsh and Marcus came to light. Her testimony had cleared Thomas's name completely, and she'd stayed on, determined to make amends by caring for the growing community. Thomas must be over the moon, Ruth observed, watching Eleanor's gentle smile. He's terrified, Eleanor admitted with a soft laugh. But happy, so very happy. The sound of horses drew their attention. A carriage, unusual for these parts, was making its way up the trail. Eleanor frowned, not recognizing the vehicle. Were you expecting anyone? Ruth asked. Before Eleanor could answer, Thomas was striding toward the house, his expression guarded. The past months had brought peace, but old habits died hard. Unexpected visitors still put him on edge. The carriage stopped, and a well-dressed woman emerged, middle-aged, with graying hair arranged elegantly beneath a traveling hat. She looked utterly out of place against the rugged backdrop, but it was her eyes, hazel, sharp, achingly familiar, that made Eleanor gasp. Mother? Mrs. Catherine Whitfield stood uncertainly, taking in her daughter's transformed appearance, the practical dress, the work-roughened hands, the obvious pregnancy, the mountain man approaching with protective concern. Eleanor, her mother said, voice trembling. My dear girl, I've come such a long way to find you. The reunion was awkward, emotions tangling like wind-blown yarn. They sat in Eleanor's parlor, a room that had grown comfortable and welcoming under her care, while Thomas hovered nearby, clearly unsure of his place in this unexpected family drama. How did you find me? Eleanor asked, serving tea with hands that barely shook. Your friend Mary, from the boarding house. She forwarded your letter about the wedding. Catherine's eyes kept drifting to Thomas, assessing. I had to come. Had to see for myself that you were, well, I'm more than well. Mother, I'm happy. In this wilderness, Catherine gestured at the window, where mountains loomed majestic and eternal. You were meant for civilization, Eleanor, music, society, culture. I was meant for this, Eleanor interrupted gently. For honest work, real partnership, a life built on truth rather than pretense. Her mother's face crumpled. I failed you after your father died. I was so concerned with maintaining appearances, finding you a proper match. When that horrible man, when Hartwell... Don't! Eleanor reached across to grip her mother's hand. That wasn't your fault. But I made it worse, didn't I? The shame, the pressure to disappear quietly. Tears flowed freely now. I drove you to this desperate measure, becoming a mail-order bride. You gave me the greatest gift. Eleanor said firmly, You set me free to find my own path. Yes, it began in desperation, but look where it led. She smiled at Thomas, who'd been silent throughout. Mother, this is my husband, Thomas McKenna. Thomas, my mother, Catherine Whitfield. Thomas inclined his head politely. Ma'am, you raised a remarkable daughter. Catherine studied him with the sharp gaze Eleanor remembered from childhood. Mr. McKenna, I've heard stories about your past, your reputation. Mother, all true, I imagine. Thomas said calmly. I've made mistakes, faced tragedy, chose isolation over society, but your daughter saw past all that. She made me want to be better than my past. He saved my life, Eleanor added, in every way that matters. They talked through the afternoon, the initial tension slowly easing. Catherine shared news from Boston, the boarding house sold, her own move to a smaller establishment, the slow changes in society's attitudes. Eleanor spoke of ranch life, the hard-won acceptance of the town, the child growing within her. You're truly happy? Catherine asked as shadows lengthened outside. Truly, Eleanor confirmed. This isn't the life either of us imagined, but it's the right one. Her mother nodded slowly. Then I'm glad. And... She hesitated, then forged ahead. I'd like to stay, if you'll have me, not forever, but through your confinement, to help with the baby, to be the mother I should have been before. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. We'd welcome that, wouldn't we, Thomas? Her husband nodded. Family's always welcome here. The weeks that followed brought their own adjustments. Catherine, despite her Eastern refinement, adapted to ranch life with surprising grace. She helped Eleanor with household tasks, learned to appreciate the mountain views, and slowly came to understand what had drawn her daughter to this wild, beautiful place. She was there when Eleanor's labor began on a crystal-clear December morning. Sarah Hensley arrived quickly, competent and calm, but it was Catherine's hand Eleanor gripped as the pains intensified. "I'm here, darling," her mother murmured. "I'm here." Thomas paced outside like a caged mountain cat. His fear palpable, the memory of Margaret's death haunted him despite Sarah's reassurances that all was progressing normally. "She's strong," Catherine told him during a brief respite. "Stronger than I ever gave her credit for. She'll be fine." "She has to be," Thomas said roughly. "She's everything." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks rose and gold, a new cry joined the wilderness chorus. Thomas was through the door before Sarah could call him, dropping to his knees beside the bed where Eleanor lay exhausted but radiant, a tiny bundle in her arms. "A son," she whispered, pulling back the blanket to reveal a perfect, wrinkled face topped with dark hair. "Your son." Thomas touched the baby with reverent fingers, tears flowing unashamedly. "He's perfect. You're perfect. God, Eleanor." "We did it," she said softly. "All of us. We made it through." Catherine stood back, watching her daughter and son-in-law marvel over their child, and felt something ease in her chest. This wasn't the life she'd planned for Eleanor, but it was clearly the life her daughter was meant to have. They named him Samuel Thomas, honoring the man whose death had brought them together and the father who would raise him in these mountains. Little Sam, as he quickly became known, grew strong and sure in the mountain air, watched over by parents who'd fought through prejudice and past wounds to build something lasting. Carson's Creek, too, had changed. The town that had once whispered behind Eleanor's back now brought gifts for the baby. Mrs. Henderson herself, pride swallowed, appeared with a beautifully knitted blanket. "For the child," she said stiffly. "Every baby deserves warmth." It wasn't an apology, but it was a beginning. On Christmas Eve, their cabin full of friends and chosen family, Eleanor stood with Thomas on their porch, baby Sam sleeping peacefully in his father's arms. The stars blazed overhead, unmarred by city smoke or gaslight. "No regrets?" Thomas asked quietly. Eleanor laughed, the sound carrying across the snow-covered meadows. "How could I regret this? I came west seeking respectability with a stranger and found love with my best friend. I thought I needed society's approval and discovered I needed only yours. I believed I was broken and learned I was stronger than I ever imagined. You saved me," Thomas said simply. "From the past, from myself, from a half-life in these mountains. You brought spring after the longest winter. We saved each other," Eleanor corrected, leaning into his warmth. "That's what partners do." Inside, laughter rose as Ruth regaled Catherine with stories of Eleanor's first attempts at frontier cooking. Sheriff Watson had brought his fiddle, and music drifted into the night. Their son slept on, peaceful in his father's arms, unaware of the journey that had brought his parents together. "Next Christmas will be even better," Eleanor mused. "Sam will be walking, getting into everything. Mother's talking about moving out here permanently. The ranch is thriving. Who knows what the future holds?" "Whatever comes," Thomas said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "We'll face it together." Together, Eleanor agreed, her heart full to bursting. In all weather, the mountains stood eternal guard around them, witnesses to a love story that had begun in desperation and bloomed into something rare and precious. Two souls who'd been lost had found each other across a continent, building a life on the very edge of civilization, proving that sometimes the greatest adventures begin when we venture far from the path we thought we were meant to follow. Inside their home, the fire crackled cheerfully. Friends and family celebrated, and the future stretched before them full of promise. The mail-order bride who'd arrived with nothing but hope and a carpet bag had become a woman of the mountains, strong and sure and deeply loved. And in the shelter of Thomas McKenna's arms, with their son between them and their chosen family surrounding them, Eleanor knew she was finally, truly home. The stars wheeled overhead. The mountains slept beneath their blanket of snow. And in a cabin at the edge of the world, love had conquered all. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the Wild West, where love blooms in the most unexpected places. If you're listening to this tale, we'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below and let's connect across the miles, just like Eleanor's letters once did. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more stories of courage, romance, and redemption in the American frontier. Share your thoughts about Eleanor and Thomas's journey. Did their love story touch your heart as much as it touched ours? Until next time, partners, keep that campfire burning bright.